This is Pastor Jared Nelson. I'm bringing you another midweek devotional based on a hymn story. And this week we're doing Were You There? I don't know if you have a thought of who wrote it. Some may think that Johnny Cash did. That's the version that I grew up on. And part of the reason I walked into a guitar shop and when I saw a black guitar on the wall, I didn't care what it was. That's what I wanted because it was Johnny Cash. But he did not write that song. Actually, if you go back, we don't know who wrote it. The song first appeared in 1899 in a book called Old Plantation Songs. And this was collecting many songs that had been sung on the plantation while slaves were working in the fields. And this song was a very interesting case of what used to be called a Negro spiritual. It might just be called spirituals today. But it was a song that was simple. It was made to be sung slowly and in rhythm as you're working your way through the fields, picking cotton or tilling the soil or whatever it may be. And it was made to have multiple parts to it. You could hear where you can insert different melodies and harmonies to it. It was also something that was very simple in its lyrics. The original lyrics, as best I can tell, were you there when they crucified my Lord? Repeated, repeated. And then finally, sometimes it causes me to tremble, tremble, tremble. And then you repeat the line again. The original 4 lines, as best we can tell, were you there when they crucified my Lord? Were you there when they nailed him to the tree? Were you there when they pierced him in the side? Were you there when the sun refused to shine? And that's actually the last verse in the original Old Plantation songbook. I had to do some searching and looking online to find that, but that was the original way that it was published. In the hymnal that we have, there's actually 2 different verses that are in there. One is, were you there when they laid him in the tomb? And the next is, were you there when he rose up from the dead? These seems to be either other verses that were out there or maybe just ones that were added in order to complete the story. Because originally it just ended with the death of Christ, with his crucifixion. And it was focusing on something that was a somber note. That's perhaps the point of it being something of a lament as they're in the fields, as they are enslaved, singing the song. Another interesting thing though about this hymn is the rhetorical device that it uses. Were you there? It almost invites you in to imagine each one of these steps and slowly, because you're repeating the words, and so you're not moving on quickly. You're allowed to sit and to soak in every step that you're talking about there. It's a rhetorical device that you would also hear sometimes in African American preaching. I had a friend in seminary who was African American and preacher, and he would talk about these rhetorical devices that they would use. Were you there? They'd ask you into the story, and then they'd say something. Were you there? Or whatever the phrases that they had for that sermon, something that allowed you to think and ruminate about what was being talked about. It's artistically simple and yet profound. But what was the meaning of it? Why is it a special song? Well, the story originally was probably just to communicate the story and to think about the story as they were going through the fields. But there's actually some other theology that can be there. I entitled the sermon series, Were You There?, about a year and a half ago, at the end of Luke's gospel, as we thought through the different people in the story of the crucifixion, whether it was Herod or Pilate or the soldiers and that were at the cross, or John. All these different people were there. And what did it look like through their eyes? Well, it's not just a story device to think about it. There's some theology that's behind that as well. There's 2 other ways, other than just thinking through the story, in which we ask, were you there? Number 1, were you there in the guilt? That's a question. Well, when they're shouting, crucify him, would we have been in the crowd? Is there a way in which we were in the crowd? In fact, Romans 5 tells us that we are in Adam, that we sinned in Adam, that our sin was there. We have a connection to all who have sinned throughout history. And in a sense, our guilt was there. Our guilt is the reason that he had to go to the cross. And before you can have a place in the cross, before you can have an interest in it, before you can have benefit from it, that's one thing you have to answer, is say, yes, I was there. My sin put him there. The song asks us, in a sense, to consider that as well when we're thinking about the question of, were you there? And secondly, there's another way in which we were there. And it makes me think that maybe this is what the original text was that made the person who ever started singing this start to think about that. Romans 6:6 says, we know that our old self, or Adam, our old self was crucified with him in order that the body of sin be brought to nothing, so that we would no longer be enslaved to sin. I mean, to think about that. We were crucified with him. Were you there when they crucified my Lord? And if you were, then you're no longer really a slave. It actually makes that song a little bit of a seditious act, singing it. Not, maybe the slave in the field knew his Bible a little bit better than the slave owner, and didn't realize the fact that they're singing about a time in which there's no more slavery to sin or anything else. That's one of the things that makes me love that tune. There's a couple of versions of it that are out there. One of my favorites that I was introduced to it was Johnny Cash's, where he sings just the original lyrics to it. Doesn't add the hopeful part at the end, were you there when he rose up from the dead. There's also another one that's out there. You don't have to like it if it's not your style. It's by a Christian artist named Shylin. It's originally where I got the idea to use that song as a sermon series, where he starts asking all the different characters that were there, were you there? And uses were you there as the chorus to it. I'll put both of those in the description below if you want to listen to this old hymn. But in reflecting on this hymn, we would just ask, were you there? Can you confess that your guilt is what put Christ there? But then there's another way in which you're there. If you're crucified with him, we are also raised with him in newness of life, if our trust is in what he did for the forgiveness of our sins. That's a thought I'd want you to take with you. I hope you were there, nailing your sin to the cross and receiving the benefit from his death and resurrection. I hope you are well, and this was a blessing this week. Thank you, and God bless.